I was only about 10 years old, but I do remember seeing the TV images beamed around the world of the terrible aftermath of the poisonous gases billowing out across Bhopal from the Union Carbide factory. It was the world's biggest, and I think still is the world's biggest industrial accident. Over 500,000 people were affected, tens of thousands of people were injured, thousands of people died. And of course, the accidents and the scandals didn't stop there. I can talk about Nike sweatshops, I can talk about Enron, I can talk about Deepwater Horizon, I can talk about Volkswagen, or most recently FTX. So there is one strand to this conversation today which has this long history, and it's about trying to mitigate what can sometimes be the not inconsiderable negative consequences of doing business. It used to be called CSR, these days it seems to be called ESG more frequently. So that's number one. And I think we have to be aware of that history in our conversation. Number two is that essentially we're in quite big trouble. Or as we more clinically these days call it, we're in a polycrisis. This isn't just anymore about the climate crisis, the sixth mass extinction, or even global wealth inequalities. This is now also about the fact that nurses have to go to food banks, the fact that a month or two ago, we were all having shortages of fresh fruit and vegetables in our supermarkets, and maybe this one riles me the most, maybe because I grew up in Switzerland, the fact that train companies now seem to think it's okay to tell you that they're going to be cancelling some trains the next day. And when did that become acceptable? So somehow there's all these crises going on kind of everywhere we look. There seems to be stuff breaking down, and it's quite confusing, it's quite discombobulating. And I think there is an element where we look to this conversation about purpose to give us an answer to that as well. And thirdly, I have many colleagues who work in this area and talk to many people in this area, and they tell me, there is a lot of confusion around purpose. Now, I actually think there's not that much confusion. It's not that difficult. But I do think we are very conflicted. I think real purpose conflicts with the management and economic theories that have dominated the last 40 years, and from which, if we're very honest, actually we all in this room have probably done quite well from. So there's a long history of trying to mitigate negative consequences. Secondly, we're not that good at doing the right thing, and we do look to purpose to try and provide some answers to this difficult situation that we're in. So let's move on to the three concepts that I think are useful to understand. And I'll take you back to 1994. An Interface, the world's biggest carpet tile manufacturer, set itself a challenge to be what it called zero harm by 2020. No harm to the environment from doing its business. And astonishingly, by 2019, they had actually done that. They had almost eliminated their carbon footprint. They were putting almost nothing to landfill, and the last few percentages they were offsetting. So in 2019, they had to articulate a new strategy, which they call Climate Takeback. And it's an example of a very interesting switch that happened. They said, it's no longer enough just to not do any harm. We actually have to make a positive contribution. And it's a switch that I call going from avoiding negatives to creating positives, and which I'm very familiar in thinking as the distinction between CSR and social enterprise as well. So that, I think, is the first idea that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about purpose. For the second one, let me take you to 4 months after the Good Friday Agreement, and a huge bomb went off in Omar with lots of tragic consequences and lots of trauma. And David Bolton was one of the co-founders of the Northern Ireland Centre for Trauma and Transformation, set up, amongst other things, to help the community of Omar deal with what has happened. And he had some good news. He said to people, you are going to get better, you are going to recover. And he had some surprising news, because he said, the way that you're actually going to recover is that you are going to recover best if you help someone else. Now, this is a specific example of a wider concept that the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl first talked about, called self-transcendence, literally going beyond yourself. Viktor Frankl identified that if you want to have purpose, What you need is a cause or maybe another person who is literally bigger or beyond yourself that you are dedicating what you do to. And it stands in contrast to the other big psychological theory of its day, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the top of which most of you I'm sure will know actually stands self-actualization, becoming the best I can be, fulfilling my potential. So this difference between self-actualization and self-transcendence, I think, is the second concept that we need to bear in mind when talking about purpose. And for the last one, I'm going to take a quick excursion into the land of complexity and complex systems. Our economy is a complex system. The organizations we work in are complex systems. But I like to talk about our bodies. Our bodies are also complex systems, and they behave in very similar ways, actually, strangely. But we're a lot more familiar with them. And one of the classic hallmarks of a healthy complex system is what's written here, that the health of the whole depends on the health of the parts, and, importantly, vice versa. Now, we used to think about half of that. I know that if I've broken my leg or I've got a dicky heart, the whole body is not healthy. So far, so good. But we're not as used to thinking about the other side of that equation. And the reason for that is that we're not very good, or we're not very used to thinking about something that's called, in complex systems, emergent properties. Systems at their whole can display properties that their individual parts do not display, and that you would never predict the whole system would have if you only look at the parts. So to give you an example, in our human bodies, I as a whole body, as a human being, am conscious. But you could look at an individual human cell of mine, and I don't think you would ever think that that cell could be conscious, even if you put it together with a few trillion other cells, as happens in the body. So it seems like in complex systems, like our human bodies, cells actually actively work towards not just avoiding negatives, but actually creating the positive of working towards some of these emergent properties that are necessary. And they self-transcend because they have this wider purpose. And of course, that is necessary for them, because if I fall unconscious, I'm not going to be able to eat, I'm not going to be able to drink, I'm not going to be able to move out of harm's way, and the individual parts of my body are not going to be healthy for very long either. So cells seem to work towards the health of the whole. Now, there are, of course, some cells that manage to escape this kind of slightly humdrum existence. You know, they're more efficient, they grow more quickly, they build all kind of infrastructure to allow them to be more productive. They even manage to kind of replicate themselves into other parts of the body. And in classic management jargon these days, we will probably call those cells winners. They're real kind of winner cells. Interestingly, in medical jargon, we call those cells cancer. And I think it's quite interesting to kind of notice that the only types of systems where we think that kind of behavior is success is in our organizations and in our economy. And of course, the issue with cancer, what it does is that it does not take account of the health of the whole. It does not self-transcend. It does not try and ensure that the body can remain healthy as a whole system as well. So, with those three concepts, I think we're armed to kind of look at our four schools of thought on purpose. And I hear bits and pieces of these different schools mixed together in lots of conversations about purpose. And I think it's helpful just to kind of tease them apart. And I hope it'll help us all have a clearer and more rigorous conversation this afternoon. The first one you won't be surprised about is the Profit-Focused School of Purpose. This started in 1970. Milton Friedman wrote his article in the New York Times saying the one and only purpose of business or social responsibility of business is to use its assets and its activities to increase profits for shareholders as long as it does that within the law. Now, there are not that many people who kind of actively advocate this way of thinking about purpose anymore, although you can actually still find some kind of purpose and mission statements that conform to it, although thinly veiled, I would say. Now, I admit the one on the left is out of date, but I put it there because it's quite a famous one from General Electric. But the one on the right is actually still a current one from ASOS. And I think you'll see where the number one kind of is going. It's really number one on behalf of our shareholders, I would say. As I say, I don't think that many people actively advocate for this anymore, but it has cast a long shadow, amongst other things, to the US Business Roundtable, which since 1997 has been including this shareholder primacy doctrine in all its official guidance. And until, that is, 2019, when, incredibly, the US Business Roundtable came out. This is an organization of 180 or so of the biggest US corporations, very influential. They came out and said, actually, the purpose of the organization now is to create value for all our stakeholders, not just our shareholders. And this was a big symbolic move, not least because it prizes away mainstream corporate America from the Friedman Doctrine. Big in symbolic terms, but I would argue very incremental in other ways. Partly because I think the stakeholder value that they're talking about creating is really about avoiding negatives. For example, I think they are largely talking about not having slave labor in your supply chain and all the equivalents of that. Equally, the self-transcendence. Okay, they have moved out a little bit, but I liken it to having increased your sphere of influence from just yourself, your shareholders, to maybe your nuclear family. But it's not really gone all that far. Now, we can find lots of mission and purpose statements that conform to this. The one on the left here hasn't changed for over 20 years since I was there. This is McKinsey, classic one. And the one on the right is Cisco, even more classic, all about our stakeholders. The next school of thought, though, the third one, I think is really interesting. This one takes quite a big leap. And it's advocated, for example, by the British Academy. And it states that the purpose of a business is to solve human problems profitably. And it's a big leap because I think now we are genuinely getting into the realms of creating positives. We're solving human problems. And we've also just expanded our lens by quite a lot. Human problems could affect anyone in the world. That's fantastic. But we still have this little word profitably stuck on the end. I love the analogy which someone told me, which is that profit to business is like breathing to humans. We have to do it, but it's really not the reason why we exist. And moreover, if we hyperventilate, we can lose consciousness. And that's not a good thing, as we now know. So why can't we prize ourselves away from this little word? Why do we have to emphasize the breathing? What about the eating? What about the digesting? What about the sleeping? All those other things that we also have to do that we don't have to highlight in this particular way. Now, I think most kind of purpose statements these days actually do conform to this third school of thought. Google on the left and Tesla on the right. You know, everyone's kind of realized you've got to put a big problem out there. Try and avoid mentioning yourself in your mission statement. That's a good idea. You know, and it looks quite inspiring. And yet, I talk to people about, for example, these two companies and others as well. And I say, you know, do you think they're really purpose-driven? And everyone feels a bit equivocal about it. It's like, well, I don't know. I don't know. Is Google really purpose-driven? I don't know. Is it just that they're hyperventilating, making too much profit? Is it that how they make their profit, that, you know, that has too many unintended consequences? I don't know. But I do think that we can solve this by looking at the fourth school of purpose, which is the one that we subscribe to at On Purpose. And I want to tell you about two companies. The first is called Vitzu. And Vitzu is a furniture manufacturer and retailer founded in 1959. They sell globally. They have a very reputable high-end brand. They do very well and have been going for a long time. And their purpose is to help more people live better lives with less stuff for longer. Now, those two last things are obviously the interesting one. And you'll kind of go, yeah, sure, everyone says that kind of thing. But actually, they really mean it. They actually have ensured that all their furniture is backwards compatible to 1959. The main thing they sell is shelving systems. You know, shelves, you can move them around to arrange them in the way that you want. So if you bought a shelving system from them in 1959 and one of your shelves breaks now, you can just go into the shop and buy a single shelf and it'll fit. And I kind of went, well, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? And I talked to a designer and says, well, yes, well, hang on a sec. That's a really big deal. That is very difficult to achieve. So that's just one example of what they do. Secondly, they do not incentivize their salespeople on volume. They'd rather you buy less and come back in future if you need more. They never discount and they never have sales because they don't want to manipulate you into buying too many things. And they also are the only company that I've heard described as operating a loss follower model as opposed to a loss leader model. So if you have a shelving system from them and you're about to move house, they will, for free, come to your house, take down your shelves, spruce them up a bit and put them up in your new house just to make sure that you don't throw away, please don't throw away the shelves that we sold to you. Now that, I think, is incredible. The second company I want to tell you about is Handelsbanken, one of the most successful Swedish banks, founded 49 years ago. They describe their advisors as kind of doctors to their financial customers. And just like doctors, they take an oath to do no harm. And that includes the fact that they will not sell you any product that they don't think is the right product for you. So they won't cross-sell you their own products if they don't think it's the best on the market. If someone else has a better product, they'll say, well, go and buy it over there. That's going to be best for you. They also, like doctors, don't advertise or market their services. And they take an incredibly long-term view to their business. Now, you see, I think these two companies are behaving much more like human cells in a body. They have identified what is it that I need to do, what is my role, and how am I going to do that in a way that keeps the systems I am part of healthy. They seem to be rooted in a genuinely different set of values and assumptions and beliefs about what business is here for. Unlike the US Business Roundtable, which basically still conforms to the same values and assumptions and beliefs as the previous schools of thought, this comes with a different worldview and a different mindset, which I think is necessary to reach this kind of purpose. Now, just imagine, and that comes to basically the purpose statement that we then subscribe to, which is that the purpose of any organization is to contribute to the health of the systems of which you are a part. Now imagine for a minute an economy where all organizations conform to that. That would be incredible. Now I know you'll say, well, that's a bit naive, that's going to take ages to come about and all the rest of it. But actually, I take comfort from the fact that in complex systems like our economy, change can happen incredibly fast once you reach a tipping point. And a tipping point can be reached with as little as 10% of the system changing. So what we need to think about is how can we help change 10% of the system? And one way to do that is to start becoming much better at spotting these kind of organizations that are working in very different ways with very different values, very different assumptions, and very different beliefs about what business is about. And if we can spot them and talk to them about them, then we can highlight them and we can start emulating them. And then more people will start joining that way of doing business and change will happen. So for me, actually, this afternoon's purpose, if you like, is to do exactly that. Is to hear about, talk about, spotlight, and emulate businesses that are doing things in very different ways that are already aligned with a much healthier future. I'm very much looking forward to the questions and the rest of the debate this afternoon. Thank you very much.